Haley Rivers had spent nearly her entire life in Charleston, South Carolina, and the city had shaped itself around her with the quiet intimacy of a long-familiar companion. She knew its rhythms the way a sommelier knows a wine's breath. The briny heaviness in the air before summer storms, the creak of old shutters along East Bay Street, the soft glow of lanterns on restored brick facades. For years, she had built her name inside one of the most respected restaurants on the coast, rising from a nervous trainee polishing glasses to the architect of its award-winning wine program. Guests recognized her before recognizing the menu. Critics mentioned her pairings as often as they mentioned the chef's dishes. On the night of the charity auction, she believed she was standing on the edge of the next chapter. The event was one she had curated from the ground up: rare vintages, aged bourbons, private cellar consignments, each bottle verified, cataloged, and presented with an understated elegance she took personal pride in. The old brick warehouse chosen for the auction had been transformed into an industrial chic gallery of glass and amber reflections. Soft golden lighting traced the edges of wooden crates and display tables. Crisp white linens added a sense of gravity to the evening. The air hummed with anticipation. Haley walked along the rows of bottles before the doors opened, touching each display card to make sure it lay perfectly aligned, wiping a tiny speck of dust from a vintage burgundy, adjusting the angle of a spotlight so the label caught the warm glow just right. She worked with the meticulous calm of someone who believed that precision was its own language of respect. The restaurant's owners had hinted more than once that if the evening went well, they wanted to discuss her long-awaited partnership stake. She had rehearsed the conversation in her mind for weeks, imagining where she would sit, what words she would choose, how her hands would stay steady. When the first guests arrived, Haley greeted them with a poised smile and a practiced warmth. The air filled quickly with the scent of perfume and polished wood. The faint chill of late autumn coastal wind dragged in through the warehouse doors. The murmur of donors and collectors comparing notes on which lots they intended to pursue. Servers glided through the space with champagne flutes. Photographers captured posed pockets of conversation. The warehouse resonated with the soft clink of crystal. Everything felt aligned, until it didn't. Haley had been answering a question about the provenance of a rare sansera when she noticed movement near the far corner of the warehouse, between two towering shelving units used to store backup inventory. Lucas stood there, partially hidden by shadows, leaning too close to the restaurant owner's young assistant. Their posture was unmistakable. The way his shoulders turned toward her, the way the assistant's hand rested lightly on his chest, the angled tilt of intimacy reserved for people who were no longer just colleagues. The sight passed through Haley like a sharp, clean fracture. Her breath faltered for a moment, catching in her throat with a metallic taste. For a heartbeat, she waited for Lucas to step back, waited for the assistant to move aside, waited for the illusion to right itself. But nothing shifted. The two remained in quiet proximity, absorbed in their own corner of the evening, confident enough not to hide properly. Haley's pulse thudded against her ribs. Her hands grew cold. Yet her face remained composed, sculpted by years of service industry discipline. She handed off the wine she'd been holding, murmured an apology that no one really heard, and walked toward the opposite side of the warehouse, keeping her shoulders straight and her expression neutral. She didn't allow herself to feel, not yet, not in this room, not with the restaurant owners only a few steps away. Her life had taught her that emotions could wait, professionalism could not. At one of the central tables, she paused to steady her breathing. Rows of bottles stood in impeccable order, but her focus blurred around the edges. She traced the embossed lettering on a label, grounding herself in routine, in the ritual of craft. That was when she noticed a man watching her, not with curiosity, not with pity, but with the assessing stillness of someone accustomed to noticing what others missed. Nicholas Drake. His presence in Charleston was never trivial. He owned a chain of climate-controlled vaults that catered to an elite mix of art collectors, restaurateurs, and people whose business moved quietly beneath the surface of polite society. The rumors around him shifted depending on who was telling the story. To some, he was a savior of rare collections. To others, a shadow broker operating between legality and something just beyond it. Nicholas stood across the table from her now, hands in his pockets, expression carved from a calm too deliberate to be casual. He did not pretend not to see her distress. He also did not intrude on it. He simply held her gaze for a fraction longer than was socially expected, acknowledging, without words, that he recognized the moment she was trying to hide. Before she could fully process that unexpected connection, another problem surfaced. A guest examining one of the top lots frowned at the label, then quietly summoned another collector. The two compared photos on their phones, their voices dropping into sharp murmurs. Soon a third guest approached, inspecting the bottle with furrowed brows. The tension spread through the room like a slow leak. Whispers turned into speculation. Speculation edged toward accusation. Someone called for the restaurant owner. Someone else insisted the vintage must be fake. Haley felt the room pivot toward her, as though she were the fragile axis of a wheel gathering speed. Her stomach tightened. She knew this bottle. She knew the supplier. She had verified the shipment herself. She would have staked her name on its authenticity. And yet the murmurs grew louder, threatening to collapse the event she had poured months of labor into. The restaurant owners hesitated, their confidence evaporating under the scrutiny of donors and collectors. One of them shot Haley a look, uncertain, questioning, almost defensive, as though searching for someone to absorb the blame. That was when Nicholas moved. He stepped forward with a calm that cut through the rising noise, producing a bottle from his own private collection, a vintage nearly identical to the disputed one, its documentation impeccable. His offer to substitute his bottle for the questionable lot was delivered quietly, with a fluid practicality that left no room for debate. It was the gesture of a man used to stabilizing volatile rooms. Organizers accepted his offer almost instantly. The guests retreated from their hostility, reassured by the seamless transition. The evening repaired itself with surprising speed, the whispers shifting from suspicion to admiration. Haley watched Nicholas from across the table as the crisis dissolved. He had protected the integrity of the auction and her reputation without ever directing attention to himself. He simply stepped back into the dim light once order was restored, as though his presence had been nothing more than a passing correction. But Haley knew better. In the span of a single evening, she had lost the version of her life she thought unshakable. A loyal partner, supportive colleagues, an environment where her efforts translated cleanly into respect. And yet she had gained the attention of a man who saw through illusions with unnerving clarity. A man whose intervention revealed that he understood both the fragility and the value of her work. Her world had cracked at multiple seams before midnight. The path that lay ahead was no longer the one she had carefully constructed. It now curved toward someone who turned chaos into opportunity, and who watched her as though he already knew she stood at the beginning of a story she had never intended to enter. Haley woke the next morning with the brittle clarity of someone who had shed an old life overnight without meaning to. The sunlight that filtered through the blinds of her apartment felt too bright, too direct, exposing every crack in the facade she had worn the night before. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, emails, text messages, missed calls, but none of them brought comfort. By the time she reached the restaurant, the owners had already gathered without her, their expressions arranged into polite stiffness the moment she walked in. They chose their words carefully, as if selecting fragile glassware. They spoke of procedures, of reputational risks, of temporary suspension. They claimed the counterfeit bottle raised questions about her oversight. They insisted they were not accusing her but needed to protect the restaurant's integrity. Through it all, Lucas stood behind them like a pillar of concern, offering a supportive nod at precisely timed moments, as though performing empathy for an invisible audience. Haley listened without interrupting. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, fingernails pressing into her skin, grounding her against the weight of humiliation. The owners framed the situation as unfortunate but necessary. Lucas framed it as solvable. He promised he would talk to them, that he would fix this, that he would stand by her. The words were practiced, soft around the edges, but to Haley they sounded like the closing of a door. She left the restaurant with her job on hold, her reputation suspended in a fragile limbo, and a sickening certainty that Lucas had not lost a single thing. Not his position, not his influence, not the polished charm he used so easily. She felt stripped bare, and yet profoundly free in a way she did not expect. It was late afternoon when she saw Nicholas again. He waited outside the warehouse where the auction had taken place, leaning against his dark sedan with the casual confidence of someone who chose where he belonged rather than asked for a place. The breeze from the harbor tugged at his jacket. Sunlight glinted off the metal clasp of his watch. He did not pretend surprise at seeing her. He simply straightened and stepped forward, as though greeting someone he had anticipated all along. Nicholas explained that he had heard about her suspension. News traveled fast in circles where power flowed like an undercurrent beneath every social ritual. He offered no condolences, no platitudes. Instead, he proposed a solution she had not expected. His vault network, he said, had recently taken on a series of high-value private collections in Savannah. Some held rare wines that required authentication. Others contained bottles with disputed lineage. His team needed someone with both palate and precision, someone who could identify subtle inconsistencies, who could trace provenance through taste and memory. The job was temporary, flexible, and discreet. It required her to travel between Charleston and Savannah, working inside secure facilities where cameras were fixed, alarms were silent, and the walls seemed to remember every secret that passed through them. Haley listened, intrigued despite herself. Nicholas spoke with the quiet certainty of a man who had designed his own world and needed only to place the right pieces into motion. He acknowledged that the work came with complications. Some clients valued privacy to an extreme. Some were known more for their wealth than for the legitimacy of their acquisitions. But he promised her autonomy, anonymity, and the freedom to use her skill without interference. She should have refused. She knew that. She knew she was standing on the edge of something she could not easily reverse. But the sting of betrayal was still raw, and the idea of returning to the restaurant, of returning to Lucas's shadow, felt suffocating. The offer from Nicholas was dangerous, yes, but it was also clean, free of pretense, free of the delicate diplomacy she had been forced to perform for years. By the following week, she was in Savannah. The city greeted her with thick, perfumed humidity and moss-draped streets that seemed suspended between history and something more elusive. Nicholas's primary vault facility sat near the riverfront, in a renovated shipping warehouse fortified with modern security. Inside, the temperature remained meticulously controlled. Every sound was softened by insulated walls. Every corridor smelled faintly of oak, dust, and cold metal. Haley was given access to a private workroom lined with glass cases, steel shelving, and archival drawers. She moved through them with a careful reverence, examining labels, comparing handwriting on decades-old documents, weighing corks in her palm to judge elasticity. Hours dissolved into the precise ritual of tasting and recording. She identified counterfeit labels that mimicked printing styles from the 1940s, but used dyes developed in the 1960s. She found a rare scotch whose cork had been tampered with and resealed using an adhesive that did not exist at the time it was supposedly bottled. She uncovered inconsistencies in shipping manifests that revealed shipments that had never passed through the ports they claimed. Her skill was undeniable, and Nicholas made no attempt to hide his satisfaction. He checked on her progress regularly, though never intrusively. He watched her work with an intensity that suggested he valued observation as much as action. In the dim glow of the vault lights, his presence felt like a constant hum at the edge of her awareness, steady, controlled, and undeniably commanding. Their collaboration grew into an unspoken rhythm. He handled negotiations with clients who did not like to be questioned. She handled the bottles that did not like to be lied about. When she presented her first comprehensive analysis, a report that exposed a small but deliberate counterfeiting pattern, Nicholas read it without interrupting, his expression sharpening with interest. But the deeper she went, the more she realized the pattern was not isolated. The counterfeits were too well executed, too consistently placed across unrelated collections. Someone was running a sophisticated operation that relied on wealthy collectors who preferred not to look too closely at their acquisitions, people who cherished the illusion of rarity more than the truth of it. As the threads aligned, it became clear the scheme had flourished for years, woven quietly into the city's upper circles, exchanged at charity galas, whispered during private tastings, buried under donations and political favors. And now Haley, with her keen senses and uncompromising precision, was the one unraveling it. She was no longer just analyzing bottles. She was stepping into a web of influence that connected collectors, politicians, and private brokers, some legitimate, some not. And the more she uncovered, the more Nicholas watched her with a new depth in his eyes, as though he understood that the quiet, composed woman standing in his vault had just shifted from employee to indispensable ally. She hadn't planned on this new path. She certainly hadn't planned on him. But the momentum had already changed. and the world she'd known before the auction felt smaller with every secret she exposed. Haley had always believed that wine told the truth if one knew how to listen. It carried the soil, the year, the hands that had touched it. Now, standing alone in the cold light of the vault, she realized someone had learned to make that truth lie beautifully. The pattern did not reveal itself in a single day. It emerged slowly, like a stain bleeding through white cloth. She started with minor discrepancies. A burgundy whose declared harvest year did not match the microscopic pattern of sediment. A Tuscan red with a cork that had aged 20 years faster than the glass around it. Each anomaly, on its own, could have been dismissed as a mistake. Together, they formed a map. She began to track them on a large board in her workroom, pinning scanned certificates, shipment records, and inventory logs. Thin red threads connected vault numbers, client codes, and dates of acquisition. The more she mapped, the clearer it became that the counterfeits did not exist just to deceive collectors. They were placeholders, vehicles designed to move money cleanly across borders and balance sheets. Bottles passed from anonymous shell companies to private collections, then appreciated in value just in time for charitable donations, loan guarantees, or quiet settlements. Some had been pledged as collateral for loans that never truly existed. On paper, fortunes were being shuffled through cellars, auctions, and restaurant lists. In reality, the liquid inside many of those bottles had never seen the vineyards named on their labels. Nicholas watched her process evolve with silent attention. He stood with his hands in his pockets as she explained how vintage dates aligned too neatly with certain financial events, how certificates bore identical microprinting errors that could not have come from different issuing bodies. His gaze moved from the board to her face, weighing not just the information, but the cost of what she was uncovering. He understood before she said it out loud. This was not just boutique fraud. It was a laundering system finely tuned to the rhythms of prestige and greed. The clients involved were not simply foolish collectors. They were investors, industrialists, and political donors who had chosen a very elegant way to scrub their money clean. The first threat arrived in the form of an envelope without a return address. It waited for her outside the small apartment she had rented in Savannah, wedged carefully under the door. Inside, on heavy, expensive paper, were only 2 lines typed in a simple serif font. Some bottles are meant to stay unopened, some doors too. There was no signature, no emblem, no direct accusation. But the message sat in her chest like a stone. She photographed it and sent the image to Nicholas before burning the original over her sink. He did not tell her to stop. He only tightened security at the vault, adjusted her travel routes, and for the first time, assigned one of his people to linger in the background when she left the building at night. The second message was less subtle. One evening, she returned from the vault to find a bottle placed precisely in the center of her small kitchen table. The apartment door showed no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked from the inside. The bottle wore a label she recognized immediately. The same estate that had appeared in several of the suspicious records, a name she had begun to circle on her board. Across the label, drawn in thick red marker, someone had painted a crude X. The wine inside sloshed when she moved it, dark and heavy. She did not open it. She called Nicholas instead. He arrived faster than she expected, his expression carved into something dangerously calm as he examined the bottle with gloved hands. He ordered his man to sweep the apartment, then told her in that measured voice of his that this was proof of 2 things. They were close enough to be noticed, and whoever was behind the scheme preferred intimidation to subtle warnings now. The local police filed a report with the weary indifference of people who understood very well which complaints were safe to pursue and which ones were better left as paperwork. The officer who took her statement avoided looking directly at Nicholas, but Haley noticed the small flicker of recognition in his eyes. He asked a few obligatory questions, advised her to be careful, and left with the promise to follow up. No one did. The breakthrough came in a side vault in the oldest wing of the Savannah facility, a place where collections that rarely moved were kept under deeper lock and key. Haley requested access to cross-check an inventory that had been flagged for routine auditing. What she found was anything but routine. Several crates appeared in multiple logs under different client codes, as if the same bottles had been sold and resold without ever leaving their shelves. The lot numbers were familiar. She had seen them before in a consignor's catalog from an auction in Miami, and once more in a private list sent to a restaurant group in Atlanta. Yet there was no photographic record of their transit, no customs declarations matching their supposed journeys. She pulled the cork from one of the bottles and inhaled carefully. The aroma was expertly constructed, layered enough to fool most palates. But beneath the surface sophistication, she caught a faint chemical signature, a uniformity that did not belong to any real terroir. This was not a bottle that had traveled oceans and decades. This was a product of controlled conditions and calculated deceit. The paper trail led them to a name that had floated on the edges of her earlier research. An industrial magnate based in Savannah who funded culinary festivals, restored historic buildings, and appeared at charity tables with the practiced ease of a man who understood exactly how to purchase public admiration. His companies owned stakes in restaurants, distribution networks, and event management firms across the region. Nicholas and Haley followed the transactions carefully, reconstructing the circulation of specific counterfeit lots through his associated entities. Tasting notes from exclusive events matched her records. Donation receipts for priceless bottles aligned perfectly with the appearance of nearly identical fakes in less visible collections. The industrialist had built a neat feedback loop. Laundered money became celebrated generosity, which in turn bought influence that shielded the machinery beneath. In a locked drawer in one of his auxiliary storage units, they found the documents that made Haley's pulse spike. Contracts between the industrialist and consulting experts outlined planned transitions in several high-profile restaurants, including hers back in Charleston. The language was vague but unmistakable. Her suspension had been anticipated months in advance. The replacement consultant listed in the proposals was a name she recognized from industry gossip. A sommelier whose career had been suspiciously meteoric, and who now appeared repeatedly in proximity to verified counterfeit chains. Her removal had not been an unfortunate side effect. It had been a requirement. Someone had needed her out of the way to insert a more compliant gatekeeper into a system already primed for deception. The discovery realigned something deep inside her. Until then, the investigation had been a complex puzzle, a professional challenge that appealed to her sense of order and justice. Now it became personal in a way that made her chest feel tight. Her reputation had not been collateral damage. It had been a calculated sacrifice. They had expected her to disappear quietly, to accept the narrative of her own incompetence while others rewrote the wine lists and auction catalogs in their favor. Nicholas watched her as the realization settled, his gaze steady, assessing the shift in her posture, the sharpened focus in her eyes. He did not offer pity. Instead, he spread the documents across the table in his office, building a second map beside her original board. A map of names, companies, and silent arrangements that stretched beyond Savannah and Charleston into New York, Chicago, and overseas hubs. For him, the stakes were different but no less critical. His business had always existed in the margins, in the spaces between legality and necessity. Wealthy clients trusted him to secure what they valued, whether or not it fit neatly within regulatory frameworks. But the counterfeit network now threatened that balance. If his vaults became known as conduits for falsified assets, his carefully curated neutrality would crumble. The same people who used the system would turn on him to save themselves. Haley's precision became his strongest weapon. With every bottle she authenticated and every fake she exposed, she tightened a noose around the network. Her reports documented timelines, discrepancies, and patterns that could withstand scrutiny from regulators, insurers, or prosecutors, if they ever chose to look. Yet the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the industrialist was not the final architect. His emails hinted at another figure, someone referred to only by initials or titles. Auction lots were reserved before public listings ever appeared. Restaurant owners received discreet recommendations from trusted sources. They never met face to face. Money moved through art foundations, hospitality groups, and consulting firms, all orbiting a presence that never signed anything in full. There was a mind behind the network that understood both the vanity of collectors and the cowardice of institutions. Someone who knew exactly how much corruption a city would tolerate as long as the wine flowed, the galas glittered, and the donations arrived on time. Each day Haley followed the trail further, she could feel the invisible circle tightening around them. The emails became harder to access. Lawyers began to call Nicholas with polite but pointed questions about the scope of Haley's work. One evening, as she left the vault, a car she did not recognize rolled slowly past the entrance, the driver's gaze lingering on her a moment too long before sliding away. Nicholas reacted by narrowing his own circle. Fewer staff had access to the high-level information. Meetings shifted from office boardrooms to quiet corners of private clubs, then to insulated rooms inside the vault itself. He moved through the city with the contained wariness of a man who understood he had stepped beyond the usual rules. For Haley, there was no path back to her old life. The restaurant that had suspended her felt like a distant stage set now, a place where she had once performed a simpler version of herself. Here, among the chilled shelves and locked records, she was something else entirely. A witness, a threat, and perhaps, if they were not careful, bait. The wine trail they followed was no longer just a route through bottles and notes. It was a corridor leading straight into the heart of a trap, designed by someone who understood how to use temptation, prestige, and fear with equal precision. Haley entered the courthouse knowing it was not simply a legal proceeding. It was a stage carefully arranged by people who believed they controlled every narrative. The historic building in Savannah, with its domed ceiling and heavy wooden beams worn smooth by time, had witnessed centuries of conflicts, property disputes, family feuds, criminal trials whispered through the city's memory. Now it prepared to witness a battle that had nothing to do with wine on the surface, yet was rooted in everything wine symbolized: power, legacy, illusion. The industrialist had arrived early, flanked by attorneys in tailored suits, whose confidence seemed to radiate outward like heat. His presence filled the hallway, solid, polished, wrapped in the aura of someone accustomed to applause and deference. He paused for photographers as if this, too, were part of his curated philanthropy. Reporters swarmed him with questions he had clearly rehearsed answers for. He spoke of defamation, of a targeted attack on his generosity, of malicious tampering by a disgruntled former sommelier and a businessman with an undefined reputation. Haley watched from a distance, her hands clasped tightly around a folder of documents. She knew how she looked to the media, a young woman with no institutional power, recently suspended, standing opposite a man who funded museums, hospitals, and holiday parades. Every headline framed her as unstable, emotional, driven by spite. The articles criticized her dramatic claims, her vendetta against the industry that had nurtured her talent. They avoided mentioning her credentials and the years she had dedicated to perfecting her craft. Nicholas, arriving moments later, drew a different kind of attention. Cameras shifted toward him with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. He walked with deliberate calm, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, expression unreadable. His reputation preceded him, rumors of private dealings, hidden vaults, and clients who never wanted their names spoken. To the press, he was an enigma. To the prosecution, he was a convenient villain. To the judge, he was a complication. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thicker. Light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust suspended like frozen motion in the space between past and present. The judge presided beneath the domed ceiling with the gravity of someone who understood the implications of every word spoken here. The wooden benches creaked as spectators settled in, eager for drama. The industrialists' attorneys opened with theatrical precision. They presented Haley as impulsive, disgruntled, and susceptible to professional jealousy. They described Nicholas as a man operating beyond the boundaries of lawful commerce, implying that his motives were personal rather than evidentiary. They painted the case as a coordinated attack on a respected member of Savannah's elite, orchestrated by individuals who stood to gain from tarnishing his name. Haley listened in silence, every accusation striking dangerously close to the raw parts of her pride. She could not rely on charisma or social standing. She had only facts. When her turn came, she rose slowly, placing her reports on the witness stand. She began with the bottles. How chemical composition betrays a counterfeit, how sediment layers reflect age, how cork elasticity correlates with humidity patterns in the year of production. She explained terroir signatures, microclimate markers, and the specific compounds that form only under authentic conditions. Then she displayed records of shipment logs that claimed to pass through ports closed on the days they were stamped. She highlighted the identical printing flaws across certificates supposedly issued decades apart. Each point was methodical, clinical, stripped of emotion. The courtroom shifted. Skepticism softened into cautious attention. When the industrialist's attorneys cross-examined her, they tried to reduce her findings to interpretation. They suggested she was overstretching correlations, reading too much into minor deviations. But Haley countered each argument with quiet precision, grounding every conclusion in documented evidence. She never raised her voice. She never faltered. By the time she stepped down, the room no longer saw her as a disgruntled employee, but as a specialist with insight few could match. The tension, escalated when Lucas entered. He walked with carefully practiced humility, wearing the same expression he had used during the restaurant's busiest nights, concerned, composed, slightly wounded. He addressed the court with the gentle cadence of a man accustomed to being believed. He testified that Haley had shown recent signs of stress, that she had been overly sensitive to critique, that she possessed a tendency toward overanalysis. He suggested she may have misinterpreted samples due to emotional strain. It was a subtle attack, wrapped in condescending softness, and delivered with the confidence of someone certain he would not be questioned. Then the defense produced documents. They placed them on the display screens one by one, emails between Lucas and distributors known to circulate counterfeits, payment transfers that aligned suspiciously with shipments flagged by Haley, internal communications hinting at replacement consultants even before her suspension. Lucas's composure fractured. His voice stumbled. The courtroom sensed the shift immediately. The judge called for order as murmurs rippled through the gallery. By the end of the hearing, the industrialist's spotless veneer had cracked. He was not convicted. The proceedings were preliminary, but the court mandated immediate reinspection of his storage facilities, external authentication of his collections, and temporary freezing of several business operations pending investigation. His attorneys protested, but the decision held. For Nicholas and Haley, the outcome was mixed. They were not vindicated. They were not protected. They were simply acknowledged as credible enough to be dangerous. New lawsuits loomed. New threats waited in the shadows. The network they had exposed began retracting like an injured creature, hiding its weakest limbs while preparing to strike. But something irreversible had happened in that courtroom under the old wooden beams. The first fracture had appeared. And through that fracture, light, thin, fragile, but unmistakably present, began to slip into the darkness of a system that had thrived on silence. The day before everything fractured, the air in Savannah felt strangely still, as if the city itself were drawing breath before a storm. Haley sensed it first in the silence of the storage rooms, where rows of bottles stood like silent witnesses, each one carrying a story, each one capable of betraying someone powerful. Nicholas sensed it in the way messages from his informants arrived too quickly, too cautiously, as if hands trembled over keyboards. Something was shifting beneath their feet, and they both understood that waiting any longer meant losing control of the narrative. So they acted. Nicholas secured a private event space on the outskirts of the historic district, choosing a weathered brick building that once housed a printing press. Its isolation was intentional, far enough from the city center to avoid unwanted eyes, secure enough for what they planned. Invitations went out only to experts whose reputations remained untainted. Chemists, archivists, sommeliers with no allegiance to local elites, investigators from distant states, and one former FBI analyst who still owed Nicholas a favor. Every guest arrived under confidentiality agreements, their names excluded from any record. Haley spent the day assembling the presentation. She arranged authentic and counterfeit bottles side by side, prepared chemical breakdowns, and stacked folders containing cross-referenced shipment logs. She laid out cork samples, sediment patterns, and printed magnified images of forging markers so subtle they could be missed by anyone except someone with her training. For hours she worked in near silence, the only sounds coming from the hum of refrigeration units and the soft clatter of tools as she arranged evidence into a coherent story. When evening fell, the experts gathered around long tables lit by industrial lamps. Their conversations began cautiously, murmured behind raised glasses. But as Haley revealed one detail after another, oxidation inconsistencies, forged certificates, mismatched cork origins, the tone shifted. Conversations grew sharper, more urgent. She watched as people who had never met began linking patterns she had suspected for weeks. The scale of the scheme took shape like a map unrolling across the room. Nicholas supplemented her findings with documents retrieved from his private network. Cash transfers routed through shell charities, storage rental logs under false identities, inventory lists that conveniently omitted entire batches of fraudulent bottles. Each piece fit neatly into the next, forming a structure that no single person could have exposed alone. For the first time, Haley felt the weight of momentum. The truth was no longer a quiet suspicion. It was a force, rising and accelerating. But forces attract resistance. Just after midnight, a message reached Nicholas through an encrypted channel. His expression tightened. He asked Haley to help pack the remaining boxes, but his voice carried an edge that warned her not to ask questions. They loaded the last crates of evidence into a cargo truck borrowed from an associate. The plan was to move everything to a secure location before dawn, distributing copies to trusted contacts out of state. They didn't make it far. On the Talmadge Memorial Bridge, the night split open. A black SUV appeared behind them without headlights. Another emerged from the opposite direction, cutting across lanes with surgical precision. The truck's driver, one of Nicholas's men, swore under his breath as he floored the accelerator. Tires screeched. Metal groaned. Haley clutched her seat as the truck jolted violently. The first shot sounded like a firecracker. The second shredded the rear tire. The truck fishtailed, skidding toward the railing. Haley's heartbeat thundered in her ears as the cargo behind them slammed against the metal walls. The bridge's lights streaked past in chaotic lines. The driver fought the wheel, managing to wrench the vehicle to a grinding halt feet away from the edge. Nicholas moved first. He pushed open the passenger door, scanning the darkness for movement. Another shot rang out, grazing his shoulder. Haley saw him stumble, grasping the metal frame for support. The sight struck her with cold clarity. Someone had decided they were too close to the truth. The driver shouted for her to run. Her legs obeyed before her mind caught up. She sprinted toward the bridge's maintenance access, ducking behind concrete barriers as bullets cracked against steel. Behind her, she heard Nicholas shouting her name, then the roar of engines as the attackers regrouped. She descended the access stairs two at a time, breath ragged, palms slick with sweat. Beneath the bridge, she found an abandoned warehouse tucked beside the river, its windows shattered, its door hanging crookedly from rusted hinges. She slipped inside, feeling her way through darkness dense with dust and the smell of old machinery. Hours stretched, slow and heavy. She stayed hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit, listening for footsteps, engines, anything that might signal pursuit. Fear came in cycles, sharp spikes followed by numb calm, but she held herself still. At dawn, sunlight crept through broken glass. By then, the police had already discovered the truck. Officers cordoned off the bridge, reporters gathered, and investigators examined shell casings scattered along the asphalt. The attackers had vanished, but they had left behind something they hadn't meant to: a trail. Inside the abandoned SUV, the police found discarded weapons, registered to a security firm owned by the industrialist's cousin. Paperwork carelessly tossed on the floor-referenced storage units tied to the counterfeit network. One folder contained logistical sheets with initials matching members of his board. When Haley finally emerged from hiding, trembling and dust-covered, the city was already humming with rumors. Nicholas, bandaged and furious, met her at a safe house with relief so raw it cut through his usual composure. He told her the FBI had been notified, that the evidence from the truck had blown open doors that had been locked for years. The attempted ambush had backfired spectacularly, drawing federal attention they had long needed. The fault line had cracked completely. The network began to collapse under its own weight, alliances dissolving, insiders panicking, records disappearing too late to matter. People who once operated in shadows were dragged into light, their carefully curated reputations unraveling. The system had finally overreached. And Haley, who had walked into Savannah a disgraced sommelier with nothing left to lose, now stood at the center of a case powerful enough to reshape the city's hidden world. The night on the bridge became the point no one could ignore, a line dividing everything before from everything after. 9 months after the night the network collapsed, the coast of South Carolina had settled into a quieter rhythm, one that no longer felt hostile or watchful. The tides along the Charleston marshlands rose and fell with their usual steadiness, carrying away the remnants of the chaos Haley and Nicholas had survived. The world around them had changed, but it no longer pressed inward with the same suffocating force. Life was still complicated, but now it belonged to them. The small winery on the outskirts of Charleston had once been little more than an abandoned property owned by the restaurant group that Lucas's family controlled. It had been overlooked for years, considered too small, too risky, too far from the main tourist routes to be profitable. For Haley, however, it had become the perfect blank canvas. After the investigation closed and the courts cleared her name, she purchased the space outright, using funds earned from consulting work and a modest settlement she received for wrongful termination. The renovation was slow but deliberate. She stripped away every sign of the building's former neglect and filled the space with light and clean lines. Stainless steel tanks gleamed under the skylights. Oak barrels lined the walls in evenly spaced rows. Shelves displayed the beginnings of a collection she could finally claim as her own. The front room became a tasting hall with pale wood tables, hand-thrown ceramic cups, and windows that framed the slow-moving river beyond the trees. Although the winery bore only her name on the sign, Nicholas's presence lingered in every detail. He spent months helping her restore the property, choosing materials that could withstand humidity, securing equipment from sources he insisted were entirely legitimate. His network, now carefully vetted and cleaned of its darker edges, helped connect her to suppliers she could trust, glassmakers from Oregon and independent growers from small Californian vineyards. Nicholas had recovered fully from the injury he sustained on the bridge, though faint stiffness in his shoulder sometimes betrayed the violence of that night. He had stepped back from the shadowed world that once dictated his moves, transferring his questionable partnerships into arm's-length consulting roles. His name still drew whispers in Savannah and Charleston, less fear now, more awe, as if people were unsure how a man like him had managed to reverse course. He never tried to correct their assumptions. Silence, for him, was safer than explanations. They didn't craft a fairy tale after the ordeal. What grew between them was quieter, grounded, shaped by the understanding that both of them had seen how easily life could collapse. Their days were divided between work, legal obligations, and the constant background hum of press attention. Journalists occasionally tried to revive the story, framing Haley as the brilliant sommelier who helped dismantle a counterfeit empire, and Nicholas as the enigmatic figure whose loyalties shifted just in time. She ignored most of the noise. He endured it with practiced composure. Evenings were theirs. They spent them on the back deck of the house by the water, the one Nicholas found for them after months of searching. It was a modest coastal home tucked between moss-draped oaks and the marsh, perched on stilts to guard against flooding. From the deck, they could see the tidal river bending through the reeds, reflecting the sky in long silver streaks at dusk. It wasn't grand or showy. It was simply quiet, sheltered, and wholly theirs. Haley often brought samples from her winery to taste, taking notes in a worn leather notebook. Her first line of wines, crafted with patience she never had the chance to exercise in her previous job, had surprised everyone. Critics called her work intuitive and daring, praising her ability to fuse tradition with coastal influence. She read the reviews with disbelief at first, then cautious pride. The success was hers alone, unaffected by Luca's, unaffected by the restaurant, untouched by anyone else's control. Nicholas watched her work with a kind of reverence he never voiced aloud. He had spent years surrounded by collectors who chased luxury for its symbolism, yet Haley treated her craft as something alive and demanding. Her focus grounded him, offering a different kind of order than the one he had known, an order based not on power but on purpose. The wall inside the winery held a large map divided into sections. Haley pinned notes to it constantly, adding potential vineyard expansions, collaborations with coastal farmers, events she hoped to host, and experimental blends she planned to test. It was the opposite of the board they once used to track threats, names, and relationships within the counterfeit ring. This was a map of life, not survival. Nicholas joked that the map looked like a battle plan, but Haley always corrected him. It was the first plan she had made entirely for herself. Sometimes shadows from the past returned in subtle ways. Government officials contacted Nicholas about old cases, asking questions that were more curious than accusatory. Former associates attempted to reconnect, some out of fear, some out of misguided loyalty. Haley occasionally stumbled across mentions of Luca's in the news. His business, once thriving on illusion and connections, had begun to contract under scrutiny. He tried to rebuild his reputation, but the foundation was gone. Despite these echoes, the past had lost its power to define them. It stood behind them like a warning, not a trap. Their house by the water became the symbol of that shift. Its walls held no secrets. Its silence was peaceful, not tense. The wind through the reeds, the distant cry of herons, the rushing tide. These sounds replaced the engine roars on the bridge and the pounding of her heart in the cavernous warehouse where she once hid for her life. On quiet nights, Nicholas prepared dinner while Haley sat on the deck, her legs curled beneath her, a glass of her newest blend in hand. They talked about expansion plans, about which festivals she might attend in the upcoming season, about the possibility of adding a small public garden to the winery grounds. They avoided speaking of the trial unless necessary, but sometimes Haley felt a quiet ache in Nicholas when certain topics surfaced. She never pushed. Healing, for him, moved at its own pace. The house had a narrow, private dock that reached over the water. Haley used it on mornings when mist clung to the marsh, sitting at the end with a thermos of coffee. Nicholas joined her on days when he had no early obligations, though he never stayed as long. He preferred the evenings, when the light softened and the world felt less guarded. Their life was not glamorous, not dramatic, not shaped by constant adrenaline. It was patient and hard-earned, threaded with moments of subtle joy that made the weight of their shared history feel bearable. They still carried scars, some visible, most not, but neither pretended otherwise. Honesty had become their quiet agreement. One evening, Haley stood at the edge of the dock, watching the sun dissolve in pink and copper streaks. Nicholas came up behind her, placing a hand against the wooden post as the tide lapped below. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The air between them held the warmth of everything they had chosen and everything they had survived. The winery continued to grow. The house remained their refuge, and the water beneath them carried away the remnants of every life they once thought they needed. The future they built was not born from revenge or desperation. It rose from the moment they stopped running, from others, from guilt, from fear, and finally allowed themselves to carve a new beginning. The house by the water was theirs, and it was enough. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.